Well, good morning. Good morning. Hey, you guys ready to watch the 49ers lose tonight? There was not near enough excitement, okay? We are all Chiefs fans today, right? As a Cardinals fan, we're all Chiefs fans today for the day because I cannot watch the 49ers win a game. It would just be too hard. But yeah, dude, they ain't going to be in there for a long time, so sorry about that one. Patrick Mahomes is taken home. Anyway, hey, let's talk about what's real important. Right after service, as Scott said, we're going to have some fun. It's a video game Sunday. If you're an adult, let the kids play first, and then I'm going to go beat them on Madden. That's what's up. I'm going to win the Super Bowl before the Super Bowl, just saying. But what's really important is kids camp's registration. If you have a child 3rd through 6th grade, this is our camp logo. Last year I went to camp and we went to UCYC and I thought I was done. I was like, Scott, you're in next year, I'm out. But then our staff, both here and in our surprise for Cross Church Network, said, hey, how about we make camp cheaper and host our own camp? And I was like, wait, what? That means I got to be there again. But we are super excited. We have taken the cost of camp down from $300 to $150. And we want more kids to go to camp. And if you're like, I still can't afford that, register, because I have fundraising coming for that. We're going to do some fundraiser stuff. We don't want a kid not to be able to go to camp because of cost. And we are so excited what God's going to do this summer. So I greatly encourage you, if you have a 3rd through 6th grader, right after service, the video game truck's going to be over here. You'll see us with laptops. We're going to register you, sign you up, and then your kid can get a cool shirt like this as they leave. But this morning, we are continuing our series, Radical Lectures. And if you've been with us these last couple weeks, we've been tackling some tough topics. And as we start today, I want to give you a little recap on kind of the foundation of this series. Because you see, we've been building this, and we built this off the foundation, this entire series of Genesis 1:1. And this is the very beginning of the Bible. Like, this is where it starts. This is page 1. And it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You see, that's an important foundation to build upon, because when we ask, people say, like, why are you talking about these topics? Why does it matter what the Bible says? Why does it matter what God says? Well, because God created the world, right? He created everything in it. So he has authority to speak on these topics. So as we talk about this, we've got to understand God created a world, but he also created a world of order. In verse 26 of Genesis chapter 1, we go on, and God tells us, then God said, let us make man in our own image according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, the creatures that crawl on the earth. And listen to this, God created man in his own image. He created them in the image of God. He created them male and female. You see, God, and we talked about this in our first week of our series, is God created humankind, but he created humankind with value, with dignity. And God didn't say this person has dignity and this person does not, but from womb to tomb, God said that all life has value. But then we kept going. And man, Genesis is just full of truth and wisdom, because not only did we see that God created us in his image, he created with dignity, in all human life, all has dignity, but in chapter 2, verse 24, we learned that God then created some institutions, created some designs for us to operate within. Chapter 2, verse 24, it says, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and bonds with his wife, and they become one flesh. Last week, we kind of dived through this, and we talked about how God, the first institution he created, the first design, was marriage. And he not designed man to be alone, but he designed man to be in this institution, this design, this marriage for what we're to live in. But you see, God didn't stop there, because God created institutions for us to live within, and we see these throughout Scripture. If you flip your Bibles, or it will also be on the screen as well, we see that God created governments. You know that thing we don't like? God created governments. And in Romans chapter 13, we see another institution, a design that God created for us to live within. Let me read Romans 13, starting in verse 1. It says this, let everyone submit to the governing authorities, since there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are look at this, instituted by God. Meaning there's no governments in place that God doesn't know about, and there's no governments that are in place that are outside of God's will. Verse 2, so then the one who resists the authority is opposing God's command, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason. For it is God's servant, an avenger, that brings wrath on the one who does wrong. Therefore, you must submit not only because of wrath, but also because of your conscience. In verse 6, and for this reason you pay taxes. Really? Did you have to go there? Like, come on, couldn't we have left that out? But for this reason you pay taxes, since the authorities are God's servants, continually attending to these tasks. Pay your obligations to everyone, taxes to those who owe you taxes, tolls to those who you owe tolls, respect to those who you owe respect, and honor to those you owe honor. Now, this is honestly never very fun of a passage to read, and it's really not a fun passage right before we do our taxes, right? Like, I could have read this at least 6 months ago, then I wouldn't have to feel bad about not filing right or pretending I don't owe that much. Does anyone like paying taxes here? No. Okay. I saw a good meme, and we'll put it up here because I think this is just gold. So the government comes to us and says, you owe us money. It's called taxes. So we say, well, how much do I owe? And the government says, you have to figure that out. And so I just pay what I want? Is that what TurboTax does? And they said, oh, no, we know exactly how much you owe, but you have to guess that number too. Well, what if I get it wrong? You go to prison. That's how taxes work, right? There. Exactly, right? That's exactly what taxes are in America. I don't understand it at all. Nobody understands the tax code. But the point is of what we read here is that God has established the institution of government. And we say that, well, what if a government is bad? What if it's working against us? Well, actually, this was written in the time of Rome. And they had a dictator who did some bad things. Now, where the government tells us to do something that's opposed to what God says, we don't follow that. But what Romans 13 is telling us is that there's an institution of government in place, and it's not operating outside the will of God. Now, we see, though, this isn't the last institution that God created. And this isn't the most important institution that God created. If you flip to Matthew 16, this will also be on the screen up there. We see the most important, more important than marriage, more important than government, is what is the most important institution that God created for us to live within here on the earth. Matthew 16, looking at verse 15, it says this. But you, he asked them, this is Jesus talking, who do you say that I am? Simon Peter, one of his disciples, answered, says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus responded, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And listen to verse 18. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. You see, the most important institution that God gave us is the church. And God gave us this design to operate within, this family to be a part of. And you're like, okay, what in the world are we talking about? And how, I don't understand. Because with all that said, I want you to know this is our foundation. This is kind of the lens we're looking through. And it brings us to our topic this morning. Refugees, immigration, and the southern border. You guys ready for this? You're all happy. You're like, this is exactly why I came to church. This is what I want to talk about, political dumpster fire right here. But we're going to talk about a heavy topic today, and one that has huge weight and importance of how we see our world and some of the things that we deal with. So with all that said, I first want to look at the reality of this. The reality of this crisis of refugees, immigration, and the southern border. And I think in order to start that, we got to understand what we're talking about. Because I think sometimes people lump and think this is all one big subject. But you see, there's actually a couple definitions within that. First, let's look at refugees. A refugee, as defined by Google, which I find all my definitions, is this. Is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. You see, a refugee is someone who wants to be in their home, but because of some great tragedy, they are moved from their place of living. And the thing about refugees is typically they want to go back home, but they're not able to. Maybe a war is still raging there. Maybe there's some sort of terrible famine, maybe a natural disaster that displaced them, but they want to go back home, but they cannot. Then there's an immigrant. And an immigrant is a person who comes to live permanently in a foreign country. They move from one country and go to another place, and they live there. Now, immigrants can come either legally or illegally, whereas refugees only come to this country in a legal manner as the U.S. or as any other country allows them to. So I know you guys all know that. You're like, we're the cream of the crop here. You guys are smart on this topic, not like most people. But I just wanted to reinforce, make sure we all have our definitions. And with all that established, I want to look at a few things. First, I want to see this reality in Scripture. You're like, does the Bible ever actually talk about this? Well, the Bible does deal with refugees. In the Old Testament, we know the story of this guy named Joseph. And Joseph was a cool dude. He had a coat of many colors. He had these dreams about his brothers bowing down to him. He was his dad's favorite, typical childhood drama. So his brothers decide to beat him up, throw him in a ditch. They wanted to kill him, but instead the oldest convinces them to not kill him, and they just sell him off in slavery. Sound like your childhood? Right? It's a great story. Go look it up. But Joseph goes to Egypt, and he actually rises into power. And then later, his family in Israel experiences great famine. And they have to move, and they're coming away because they're going to die. But Joseph, blessed by God, he knows this is coming, so Egypt is storing up stuff. So they welcome in the nation of Israel. Because a famine has displaced Israel, so they come to Egypt, and Joseph welcomes them in with open arms, and they have enough food for everybody. They were refugees. Israel was refugees in the Old Testament. Now, later on, generations died, and they were actually become enslaved there, which is a kind of a little bit of a word of how do we treat refugees in our country, as Egypt didn't do it the right way as it went on. But we see refugees in the Old Testament. Funny enough, we also see refugees in the New Testament. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and we all know that story. You hear that at Christmas time. You see a cute little manger scene. But they're born in Bethlehem because they had to take a census. Jesus actually lived in Nazareth. But there's a crazy dude named Herod. And Jesus and his family want to go back to Nazareth. But a crazy guy is killing babies. So they go to Egypt. And for the first couple years of Jesus' life, his parents and him are refugees in Egypt until they can go back home to Nazareth. You see, we see refugees in the Bible. But you're like, well, do we see immigration? Do we see immigrants? Well, we also see immigrants in the Old Testament. Abraham, for example, Father Abraham, who had many sons. There's a cool song about that. I don't really know it anymore. But Abraham got a vision from God, and God said, leave your place of land and go somewhere new. And he leaves and he goes to a new place. And God guides that process, and God moves him. And you see, this image of this issue of immigration is actually a very common theme in Scripture. And actually, particularly in the Old Testament, there's this Hebrew word called ger or gar, which most English translations kind of translate to foreigner or sojourner or alien. But Pastor Tim Keller kind of argues very compellingly in his book, Generous Justice, that this is best translated as immigrants. And this word, why is that so important? It appears 92 times in the Old Testament. And many of that times it's actually in a positive sense, which we'll get to this in a second. But the question is, why is this so important? Why does this matter? Because the Bible addresses these issues, just as we studied last 2 weeks, where we saw that the Bible addresses the sanctity of all human life, from womb to tomb, from abortion to caring for people, and through all stages of life. The Bible addresses that in his word. Last week, we looked at the LGBTQ plus community and gender identity. We see the Bible addresses that. And then today, as we come to refugees, immigration, and the southern border, the Bible addresses it. The reality of this crisis is that the Bible has something to say about it. Well, let's stick a pin in that, because I first then want to say, well, let's talk about the reality of this crisis in our culture today. And first, let's start with refugees. Now, I'm going to kind of say off the bat, I'm not giving my opinion on this. I'm going to give you a lot of facts. And this might be a little overwhelming and a little crazy, but we're going to get through it. First, we have a chart, and I want to show you kind of these refugee numbers. You see, since 1980, When the system for tracking and taking in refugees changed, the United States has taken over, in that time, just over 3 million refugees from around the world. And this number has been as high as about 207,000 in 1980, and it's been as low in 2018, about 27,000, or 22,000, I'm sorry. But here's the thing about refugees. Every year, the president sets a ceiling on this number. And you see two lines there. First is the blue line, and that is a cap that our president sets. And then the orange line is how many we take in. Now, usually these caps are like educated guesses of how many people we'll take in, and rarely do we ever hit that cap. Actually, in 2019, though, we did hit that cap at 30,000 in the very last week of the year. But this is how kind of it works with refugees. This is how refugees come into our country. Now, you're like, okay, this sounds great. You're like, why are we saying this? And I want you to hear me clearly as we get into this. I'm not saying one way or another, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? I'm just saying this is the reality of the situation. This is how many refugees have come into our country over the last 40 years. But I want to inform you for a reason. Because you see, as Americans, we have an awesome kind of privilege or superpower. You know what it is? We get to talk about issues like we're experts on them, even when we don't know anything about it, right? Yeah, don't believe me, just go read Twitter. I think they instilled it in the Constitution. It's no matter if you know something good or bad, you can just blab on about it and talk about it. But I'm going to give you the facts, and whether you're pro letting more refugees in or against it, here are some of the facts that you can argue with, and you have your right as an American to talk about that. We're going to talk about the church's response a little bit later. But this is the reality of this situation. But here's the thing, and I want to kind of show this, is a lot of times people will argue about this, but they really don't know really the facts of it. And so many people will say this is a bad thing or this is a good thing, but they don't even know where most of the refugees are coming from in our worlds. Fun fact, more than half the refugees from October 1st, 2018 to September 30th, 2019 came from African nations. And actually, the number one place was the Democratic Republic of Congo, which accounted for nearly 13,000 of those admitted. What's kind of funny is we say refugees come from places that there's tragedy, that there's war, and it came from a country that's a democratic republic, which it's really neither democratic nor republic, but that's where most have come from. Myanmar, almost 5,000 come from. Remember that name for later. Ukraine has 4,000. Afghanistan has 1,000, and Iraq and Syria 600 each. Keep Myanmar in mind because we're going to talk about that later. So this is how many immigrants come into our country every single year. Now let's move on to immigration. And first, we're going to start, the first number and chart you're going to see here is legal immigration stats, okay? So this is the last 3 years. And here's what I did for you guys. I went to Department of Homeland Security's website and filtered through pages and pages of numbers, just so you would think I'm smart, okay? But according to the Department of Homeland Security, for the past 3 years, there have been about 1.1 million immigrants per year added as citizens. That's crazy, 1.1 million. And it's funny how that kind of breaks out. About half of those are people who change to permanent residence, so maybe they're temporarily here on visas or they get married or something like that, and then half of those are new people coming into our country. So this is legal immigration. Put that in your mind. And what's crazy about this is we have let in more legal immigrants into our country in 3 years than we have refugees in 40 years. And the reason I say that is because sometimes people think this is all the same thing. They think this is just one big pot. It's totally different issues. Refugees and immigration are two totally different lines. 3 million people coming in 3 years and 3 million people coming in over 40 years. It's a different topic. But then let's see the real hot button topic. Ooh, I don't want to get here. Let's look at the reality of illegal immigration, which is truly what grinds people. So this chart up here. This is the big number one. This is where I'm really trying to impress you guys. You're like, I don't even know. You can't even see it from back there. I just want you to know I'm smart and look through a lot of things. You know what's actually really refreshing about being on the Department of Homeland Security website, which I hope I'm not on any weird lists anymore, they're tracking me because they're like, why are you looking up all these stats? But the refreshing thing about looking through all those numbers is that it was just like unbiased stats and like, here it is. Instead of like looking it up on CNN or Fox or name your news source that had some bias bent and takes all these facts and twists it around. It was just, here's the reality of the situation. So this is the reality of the situation. So let me give you kind of a little summary. From 2010 to 2018, there have been between 796,000 and 572,000 immigrants apprehended or arrested attempting to enter the country illegally. So we don't know how many numbers exactly people are coming into our world, but this is who have been apprehended or arrested in some manner. And actually, if you see this, in Mexico is kind of the highest one, but it's not the only one. And actually, in the last couple of years, we see people don't just try to enter by land, but by boat, by air, by sea, like, one if by land, two if by sea, like Paul Revere. They're coming in every way. And there's a lot of immigration coming from different places. But here's where I kind of want to wrap this all up to. When we talk about absolute numbers, okay, the United States has a larger immigrant population than any other country in the world. As of 2015, we have 47 million immigrants living in our country. This represents 19% of the entire 244 million entire world population of immigration, and this is 14% of our population in the United States. And that's probably even higher 5 years later as we're acquiring that data. But now, why do I say this? Because we got to understand our country has historically and is still today the land of immigrants and foreigners. We are the great melting pot. And one of the crazy things about our country is when people come here from all different backgrounds, a lot of times that culture slowly morphs into an American culture. Meaning it's rare that someone comes here and they keep their distinct culture for generation after generation after generation. They become Americanized. They become a part of this country. Now I want to stop here. And I want to reemphasize again, I'm not giving my opinion on whether this is good or bad. I'm not saying that I think this way or I think that way. I'm saying here are the statistics, here is the reality. Romans 13, as we just read, tells us that the government is instituted by God. Romans 13 says the government has a right to make laws. It has a right to make borders. It has a right to build walls if they want. But our church does not have or will not give an opinion on whether we should or should not allow more refugees, on whether we should or should not build a wall. But I'll give my personal opinion, okay? You ready? I thought there'd be a gas there or something. I'll tell you whether we should build a wall. I say build the wall. This is the wall that we need to build. Make Arizona great again. None of you guys know what that means. You're like, this guy's crazy.
That's absurd. Come on.
This is actually in Arizona State ASU colors because I'm an ASU alumni. Go Devils. And this is actually building a wall around Tucson so that Tucson would no longer be part of Arizona and they can't come up. So that was a joke as an ASU fan. Clearly none of you got it. Don't think it's funny. If you're from U of A, I don't really apologize because I don't like U of A or Tucson. But that's the only wall I'd be in favor of building. And I'm kidding there. That's a nice lighthearted joke. But in all seriousness, we don't follow here at church, and we've said this through this series, we don't follow an elephant, we don't follow a donkey, we follow a lion and a lamb. So our question is not, what should our government do about this issue? This is the reality of this crisis. It's hard. There's a lot going into this, but you can vote as a citizen. You should do that. But what we want to talk about here today is what is our job as the church? What is our response to it? As Christians, as the Church of Jesus Christ, how do we view refugees, immigration in the southern border? Well, let's look at Leviticus chapter 19, starting in verse 33. It says this. When an alien, and we said this word is actually gar, the Hebrew word, so it can be translated to immigrant as well. When an immigrant or an alien resides with you in your land, you must not oppress him. You will regard the alien, the immigrant who resides with you as the native born among you. You are to love him as yourself. For you are aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. God sets the standard for the Israelites here in the Old Testament. And he sets the standards that the immigrants who come to dwell among you, that they should be treated as the native among you. And as he gives the law to his people, he repeatedly states some protections, including to the right to fair treatment as laborers. And he talks about that in Deuteronomy 24. In Exodus 20, he talks about the right to Sabbath rest for immigrants. And in Deuteronomy 24, again, he talks about prompt payment for labor. But you see, he tells us how we're to treat immigrants as well as native-borns, and he reinforces that in Exodus as well. But the interesting thing is, throughout the Old Testament, the immigrant is repeatedly referenced with two other groups. It's kind of lumped in. It's lumped in with the fatherless and with the widow. And the thing about the fatherless and the widow in the Old Testament is those are viewed as people who are vulnerable, especially in that culture, because they don't have a structure. They don't have help among them. And God lumps those three together as these three that as the people, the Israelites of God, they were to take care of. Now, I think it's interesting because God commands his people to love both immigrants, both because he loves them, and he says that in Deuteronomy 10:18, but because, given their unique history, Israel's history in Egypt, they knew what it was like to be refugees, and they knew what it was like to be treated harshly. Now, I want to kind of stop here again. We're not proposing that we directly apply God's rules for the nation of Israel to the United States today. If you actually joined us last week and we looked at a little bit of passage in Leviticus, and I encourage you to listen to that as well, we talked about there's different types of laws. There's ceremonial, there's civil, and there's moral laws. And all the civil laws, the way Israel was set up, don't apply to 2020 America directly. But what we should see in the Old Testament is God's love for immigrants and others who are vulnerable is unchanging and should guide our response today. When we fast forward to the New Testament, we see emphatic commands to love our neighbor and to extend hospitality to strangers, to guide us in the same direction as the many Old Testament texts say, which is that Christians are to love, welcome, and seek justice for refugees and immigrants. So the question becomes, how do we do that? Well, you see our mission as a church that we derive from the Great Commission. You've heard it over. It's on our walls. It's on our T-shirts. It's on our signposts outside, is to make Jesus known. And kind of some of the interesting thing about that is the arrival of immigrants in our country actually brings the world to our doorstep. The Great Commission says we are to make disciples of Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, which meant that all over the world we're supposed to preach the gospel. And with immigration happening in our country, sometimes we have people coming to our front step where we get to share the gospel with. And I would say this also happens vice versa, is there's people who immigrate to this country who are Christians who get to share the gospel with Americans around them. But now I say, well, what does this look like? How do we do this? Well, let me give you a few practical applications of how we already are doing this and how we can continue to this. First, I'll tell you that we have a Burmese campus that meets here. You know, like, what does that mean? Well, most of you might realize this, but we actually have a Burmese congregation who are refugees from Myanmar, which is ancient Burma, who have come to our country, and they actually meet here on Sunday afternoons. Now, sometimes that can be a difficult thing. Like, I come in, I'm like, what just happened here? Like, it's like a disaster. It's crazy. But it's an amazing partnership we get to have with Pastor Moy in that church congregation, where we get to love on them. We help financially support them. We give them a place to meet for church. But we also get to continue to do ministry with. And by you being here, by you helping at Cross Church, by when you give as part of Cross Church, you're helping support that congregation. You're helping them have a church that otherwise might be very difficult for them to have. But then we also have a partnership in country in Myanmar. Our lead pastor, Jackie Allen, who's lead pastor of a Cross Church network in our Surprise campus, they actually just got back from a trip in Myanmar. And actually, later this year, we're starting a campus in Myanmar, which will look a little different. We'll contextualize that, and they speak a little bit different language. But it was a very interesting and awesome conversation. We're building a church building there for them to have their church. But what we're also doing in Myanmar is we're partnering with Hope Orphanage that helps support those who are displaced, support those that are refugees in country. Because in Myanmar, there's a lot of brokenness, and there will be refugee camps in country that people need help and love and support. And by you being a part of Cross Church, you are help supporting that ministry as well. And then lastly, I will just extend to you, we are having a Mexico mission trip from March 14th to March 17th. And it's really, the cost is $50 and you need a passport. And if you want to go to Mexico, and we're going to be able to share the gospel to partner with the church there, but we're also going to be help building structures and building a church for them in Mexico. And if you want to be a part of that, $50 and a passport, come see me after, or you can email mission@crosschurch. That ministry is happening, that trip is happening later this year. So those are just a few practical ways that our church already is and will continue to help when we talk about refugees, when we talk about immigrants. But I want to say, well, how does this come to our level? What are we supposed to do with this? Because maybe we have some hurt. Maybe we have some bias. Maybe we've been hurt by immigration in our world. Maybe we're not okay with this. Maybe this puts a pit in our stomach, and you hear all this, and you're like, well, pastor this or pastor that. Let me give you a key thought. What is best for people is what is best. What is best for people, what is best. We so often say, well, what about this law? What about this? We started in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis 1, we learned that God created mankind in his image. All mankind, not just the people we like, not just our family, not just our citizens, but all people. And ultimately, what is best for people is what is best. In the New Testament, they asked Jesus Christ what the greatest command is. And he says to love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And most people are like, oh yeah, that's a good question. But these guys were pros. They're like, hey, who's my neighbor? They're like, I mean, I'll do that, but I'll love my actual neighbor, but I'm not going to, an immigrant, oh, they're not my neighbor. I don't have to love them. What are you talking about? And then Jesus told a little story. And he told a story of what was known as the Good Samaritan. And in this story, it talks about a man who is traveling between cities. And as he travels between cities, he gets jumped, he gets beat up, he gets robbed, and his body gets thrown on the side of the road. And as he's sitting there, dying, bloody, his body there, some people start walking by him. The first that walks by him is a priest. And the priest is coming up on the side of the road. He sees the body, and then he moves to the other side of the road, and then he keeps on walking. He's like, I didn't see that. Now, funny story, or funny little side note here. A priest actually, by the law, and this will apply for the next person who just walks past him too, is if a priest were to touch a dead body, they would be ceremonially unclean. So it was against the law of God in the Old Testament to touch a dead body. So he's like, the law tells me not to touch a dead guy. That guy has flies around him. I don't know if he's dead or not. I'm just going to go on this side of the road, and I'm going to keep on going. And then a Levite comes. This wasn't quite a priest, but they were still a religious person. They're a good Christian guy. They're like a deacon. They pass out the buckets on Sunday morning. So it's like, first I walked past them, and then you're serving on Sunday morning, you walk past them. And Levi does the same thing. He's like, that dude looks dead. I'm going to just stay over here and keep going. And then this guy, a Samaritan, walks by. And the guy that got jumped was Jewish. Jew, Samaritan, it's one of the most racial, tense relationships you can ever have. They hated each other, both ways. Samaritans were mixed blood. They were half Jewish, half anything else. So the Jews hated them. They were like, if there's racism between Americans and Mexico, this was even way, way worse. And the Samaritan picks him up. He throws him on his donkey. He sees that he's alive. He patches his wounds. He takes him to the nearest hotel. He pays for his room. He tells him, here's some extra money. If he clears out the fridge of all the little mini alcohols, I'll even pay for that. I don't think they had that then. That's my thought on it. But he says, any other expenses that he incurs, I'll cover it. And then Jesus ends the story about which one of these showed love to him. And you see, we read that story, and we think about that. And when we take that and then apply it to today, where we have refugees, immigrants in our world, We got to ask, who is our neighbor? And sometimes we're like, well, they came in illegally. It's against the law to help them, which I think if you love an immigrant, you're not going to get thrown in jail. But we can fall into the trap of just like the Levite and the priest did, of saying, no, man, I can't love those people because it's against the law. And just as we said last week, sometimes we fall into the trap of finding our identity in the wrong place. Sometimes we say in the church here in America that I'm an American Christian. Man, that's the wrong order. Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said, you can't be a nationalist and a Christian at the same time. We are a Christian first, and then we are whatever citizen we are of any country. But God is our ultimate law. And so often we can be worried about breaking the law that we're living in rebellion to our own God. As we look at this issue, as we rub shoulders with these people in our world that are immigrants, that are far just as we were far from God, just remember in your head, what is best for people is what is best. Let's pray.